This book is not a history of steam navigation. It has been written rather to show how water transportation has developed. The present position, the present position in the eternal struggle between science and disaster, the wonderful and rapid growth of the big express liner during the space of 100 years. I have not confined myself to the steamship itself purely and simply, as the welfare and safety of the ocean-traveling public are affected very materially by several other influences, although the North Atlantic figures largely in this volume. This is due to the fact that it is the busiest of the seven seas. It is where new developments and revolutionary inventions invariably receive their ocean-going commercial baptism, where luxury and elegance have been carried to a supreme degree, where the ingenuity and skill of the engineer are revealed most strikingly. And finally, because it is the arena in which the struggle for supremacy between the various maritime nations is contested most keenly and enterprisingly. In the preparation of this book, I have received the heartiest assistance of various interests, both in connection with the letterpress and the illustrations. In the majority of cases, this cooperation is acknowledged in the text and beneath the photographic reproductions. In addition, I am indebted to the hydrographers of the British and United States Admiralty Departments, the editor of the Scientific American, and also the commander of the United States derelict destroyer Seneca. The volume is written essentially for the general reader who is not familiar with the techniques of the shipbuilding art, who entertains only hazy notions concerning the steamship, its design, construction, appointments, and the efforts that are being made to render water transportation absolutely safe, and who has no idea of the character of its influence upon the world's progress. Frederick A. Talbot, October 1912. If it were possible to bring back to life those early dreamers of steamship conquest, Fitch, Bell, Fulton, Miller, Watt, and Brunel, to give them a glimpse of the Lusitania tearing along at 30 miles an hour, or of the Olympic displacing some 60,000 tons, their expressed opinions would prove entertaining. In their wildest dreams they never anticipated such speedy and huge monsters as ride the waves today. While probably most of these hard-working pioneers would desire an immediate return to their resting places, one, Isambard Brunel, doubtless would show no signs of perturbation or astonishment, as he, during his wonderful career, was accustomed to conceiving and doing big things in the varied fields of engineering. From the days of 1784, when poor Henry Fitch, the American engineer, discussed the possibility of vessels being propelled by steam, and was considered crazy for his pains, to the present time is a far cry. Yet in that comparatively brief period of less than 150 years, much has happened. The seven seas today are ridden by wonderful constructions in size, power, and luxury to fulfill every purpose of water transportation. And developments move so quickly in marine circles. The shipbuilder is a man of such infinite enterprise, skill, and ability that nowadays the public ceases to wonder. The marvelous of today becomes the commonplace of tomorrow. The comet, which created such widespread consternation and wonder as she plowed up and down the Clyde in 1812, could be stowed upon the deck of the marine monster of 1912 and escape observation. It would require nearly 2.5 vessels of the size designed with such infinite labor by Henry Bell to reach laid end to end from taffrail to taffrail amidships of the Olympic. A century of marine engineering has produced vessels 900 feet in length by 90 feet wide, 175 feet in height, from keel to rim of smokestack, carrying 3,500 passengers and weighing upwards of 60,000 tons. The engines of the Comet developed 4 horsepower, the mistress of the ocean. Later, the mistress of the ocean of a century later requires 17,000 times the power of the engines fitted to the pioneer craft to maintain her speed of 26 knots per hour. There has been considerable diversity of opinion as to whether Bell or Fulton, the American though of Scottish birth, was the inventor of the steamboat. The Americans claim the honor, seeing that Fulton's first steamer appeared upon the Hudson River in 1807, but Fulton's admirers ignore the fact that their hero got his ideas from Bell and even followed the latter's advice. Bell submitted his scheme for steam propulsion to the British government and, as was to be expected, met with a rebuff from an administration soddened with conservatism and resolutely opposed to the march of progress. Lord Nelson recognized the value of Bell's invention and did not omit to convey his personal opinion to the Admiralty that, if you do not adopt Mr. Bell's scheme, other nations will do so. So it proved, because the inventor at once communicated with the United States government, who directed Fulton to get into touch with Bell. Subsequently, when the former was dispatched to England in 1804 upon a commercial mission, he called upon Bell, and the subject was discussed further, as Fulton was impressed with the possibilities of his fellow countryman's ideas. That the interview was fruitful is supported by the fact that the American took Bell's advice and acquired his steam engines from Boulton and Watt. In these circumstances, it is difficult to transfer the glory of invention from Bell to Fulton, as without Bell's assistance, Fulton would never have steamed up the Hudson River in his boat, 130 feet long. The first steamship to eclipse the Great Eastern, the Oceanic, of the White Star Line, built in 1899, exceeded Brunel's famous vessel in length by 25.5 feet and ushered in the era of the mammoth liner. The Oceanic measures 705.5 feet long by 78 feet wide, displaces 31,590 tons loaded, has engines developing 28,000 horsepower, and averages 21 knots per hour. The White Star 9-day boat, Baltic, the big combined freight and passenger vessel, although slower but luxuriously equipped, has become highly popular. The mammoth German intermediate liner George Washington. The Germans were not slow to realize the advantages of the mammoth freighter, of which this North German Lloyd boat is the finest, flying the Teuton flag. Some 6 years after the comet's momentous appearance, the Atlantic was crossed for the first time by a vessel fitted with steam engines. This was the Savannah. Although she could not be described as a steamship in the present meaning of the word, she was a hybrid. There was such little faith in the steam engine for ocean traveling that the captain of this ship hesitated to trust himself exclusively to the new system of propulsion. The paddle wheels with which she was fitted could be detached and lifted on board when desired. This vessel used her steam power for less than 4 out of the 22 days occupied in crossing from New York to Liverpool in 1818. The first steamship built for transatlantic travel was the Great Western, designed by Brunel It was Samuel Cunard, the merchant, however, who, while in Halifax, Nova Scotia, conceived the idea of meshing the seas with steamship routes in the same manner as the land was being crisscrossed by railways, and to run with a similar scheduled service and regularity. When the government called for tenders to establish a system of carrying the mails between Britain and America by steamships instead of the 10-ton coffin brigs, Cunard came to England to meet kindred spirits in Mr. George Burns and David McIver. A company was formed with a capital of £270,000 or $1,350,000. The mail contract was secured, and the first regular transatlantic steamship service was inaugurated under the flag of what is known now as the Cunard Line. The first fleet was of humble pretensions, built of wood, the 4 ships each measuring 207 feet in length by 34 feet 4 inches wide, and 24 feet 4 inches deep, capable of carrying 115 cabin passengers with 225 tons of cargo at a speed of 8.5 knots, 9.5 miles per hour, developed by engines of 740 indicated horsepower. In the course of a few years, wood was supplanted by iron for the hull, despite the mournful opposition of those who stated confidently that iron could not be induced to float. At the same time, the dimensions, displacement, and comfort of the passenger accommodation were improved, together with the power and speed of the engines. Each succeeding vessel embodied some important modifications as compared with its predecessor, as the shipbuilder and marine engineer took care to keep pace with scientific developments. When the first Cunarder appeared upon the Atlantic, the ship owner was in advance of the shipbuilder. But in the course of a very few years, the latter made up the leeway, outstripped the ship owner, and has maintained his advantage ever since. But the big ship came in the late 50s, when Isambard K. Brunel conceived his great masterpiece and, as it was termed, his most colossal failure, the Great Eastern. As it proved, she was about 30 years ahead of her times. This vessel was a wonderful construction built on the Thames, with a length of 659.5 feet, a beam of 78 feet 8 inches, and a total tonnage of 18,915. Everything in connection with her eclipsed everything in connection with her eclipsed anything which had gone before. Everything in connection with her eclipsed anything which had gone before. She was a novelty from stem to stern and from keel to funnel. Her creator was not the man to keep to hidebound traditions. Pioneering was more in accordance with his nature, knowledge, and temperament. The building of this Leviathan was watched with the greatest interest throughout the whole of these islands, Europe and America. It was fully recognized that if she were successful, she would completely revolutionize ocean transportation. The traveling public, in particular, anticipated her commission with ill-disguised pleasure. In those days, a journey across the Atlantic was not to be undertaken lightly. For the maximum of expense, one also endured the maximum of discomfort and misery. And there were very few voyaging Mark Tapleys to dispel the prevailing gloom. But with the Great Eastern, everything was changed. The public saloons were large, lofty, and spacious, as well as being most comfortably appointed. The private cabins were designed upon the same liberal scale, while the broad, wide decks afforded excellent opportunities for indulgence in a constitutional. Then again, would she not subjugate the terrors of mal de mer, owing to her great length and beam? seas which made the average liner pitch, toss, and roll in the most disconcerting manner would be unnoticed by this Titan. In a gale, she would ride the waves as firmly as a rock. The vessel was fitted with both systems of propulsion. The paddle wheel had proved its value and efficiency, but the screw was maintained to be the propelling force of the future. Inasmuch as there was a rooted antipathy to this form of propeller at the time, owing to its principles not being recognized, and because it had not been subjected to sufficient practical trial, the designers of the Great Eastern adopted both systems. On the trial trip, the paddle engines developed a maximum horsepower of 2,800, while the screw propeller engines gave out 4,700 horsepower. On this occasion, in running from Portland to Holyhead, she developed a speed of 14 2/5 miles per hour. The dual driving system demanded the continuous stoking of 112 furnaces, and the total fuel consumption ranged between 250 and 400 tons of coal per 24 hours. With her raking mass, on which could be spread some 50,000 square feet of canvas, and her 5 smokestacks, the Great Eastern certainly looked imposing, especially when passing the typical liner of those days. This vessel, which, it was claimed popularly, would flog the seas, and which tempted imaginative writers to indulge in fantastic comparisons with popular objects to emphasize her monster proportions, proved a lamentable failure as a liner. Her career was melancholy. Money was difficult to secure for defraying the cost of construction, and accordingly she was built in a hand-to-mouth manner, which was responsible for her long occupation of the building berth. By the time she was ready for her trial trip, over 700,000 pounds, or $3,500,000, had been sunk in her. A chain of mishaps attended her appearance. During the launch, she stuck on the ways and defied removal for several weeks. While proceeding round the coast, a boiler explosion occurred off Hastings, whereby 7 men were killed and several were injured, and off the Eddystone she narrowly escaped collision with a brig which carried no lights, because the master of the latter considered them a luxury until he ran into danger. In order to ascertain the possibilities of the vessel for her designed service between Great Britain and Australia, she was dispatched on a trial trip to the United States and occupied 11 days on the journey, but she could not earn sufficient money on the Atlantic to defray her maintenance expenses and repairs, although she was engaged in troopship service, so that she never ventured to the Antipodes. From the passenger service she drifted into cable-laying operations, and her most historic journey was that associated with the completion of the Atlantic cable. Then she degenerated into a coal hulk at Gibraltar. She was sold in London in 1884 for a mere £26,200, or $131,000. For a time, she served as a show ship and then ended her career as an advertising hoarding, after which she was broken up and was sold under the hammer as junk for £58,000, or $290,000. Such is the doleful history of the first monster steamship.